This is Heidi with your fire weather briefing for the week of Wednesday, April 22nd, 2026. We've been holding pretty steady across the country. The southwest and southern area geographic areas still have elevated activity. Therefore, nationally, we are at preparedness level 2. Across eastern area, we've definitely seen an uptick in activity in the last couple of weeks due to the usual spring drying trend, but so far, nothing exceptional. For temperatures in the upper left, we've talked about the March anomaly a few times by now. It was definitely a warmer than normal month for most of eastern area, especially farther to the south across the Ohio Valley. And down in the right, we see that up until the 20th of April, we've got a very similar pattern going on. Some temperatures here in the Ohio Valley are quite a bit warmer than normal, around 10 or even 13 degrees above normal for the first two-thirds of the month. Meanwhile, up in Minnesota, it's been colder than normal, which has probably been a good thing, helping to keep fire activity a little bit slower there, as the fields are pretty dry. For precipitation trends, again, remember that the month of March saw this wetter than normal pattern across the middle part of the region, and then dry ends on either side in New England and over in Minnesota, and even some parts of Iowa and Missouri. Meanwhile, down in West Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic, it was also on the dry side. Now, this pattern has continued to hold for the most part. We see a very wet pattern from Missouri over into the Great Lakes states, and it's been quite dry through the southern tip of Illinois, southern Indiana, and Ohio, over into West Virginia, out to the Mid-Atlantic, and even up into southern New England. Also, notice that the western part of Minnesota has been quite dry, and this pattern is pretty much what we've seen over the last 7 days, with this very wet area coming out of the Mississippi Valley, heading over into Michigan, and then from there over into the Northeast. Now, there's been a little bit of rain throughout the Ohio Valley and over into the Mid-Atlantic, but really not large amounts. And then Minnesota and the northwestern corner of Iowa have been pretty dry for the last week. For watches, warnings, and advisories, we can see that today Minnesota is the focus, with some red flag warnings out due to gusty winds and very low humidities, as well as dry fuels. 80-degree temperatures are expected across parts of Minnesota and down into Iowa today. A lot of 70s throughout the western two-thirds of the region. And then up in the Northeast, it's quite a bit cooler, which has been the trend for a few days now. The most impactful part of this is that the heat in the Midwest is also accompanied by these very low relative humidities today, getting down to around 20% and maybe some teens in the forecast, while max wind speeds are showing a pretty strong flow coming out of the south throughout Minnesota and down into Iowa. Thus, we've got the wind trigger out on the significant fire potential graphic today for a good chunk of Minnesota. Beyond that, elevated concern throughout much of the AOR, the exception being southern Michigan and the Northeast. Now, notice that there is some minimal chances for precipitation from Indiana over into the Mid-Atlantic and also in the Northeast, but these are going to be very scattered showers. There might be a few thunderstorms mixed in there, especially along the Ohio Valley, but it's going to be spotty, so not really enough to dampen fuels on any wide scale. As we move into Thursday, the focus of the heat shifts from the west and over into the central Ohio Valley, where you can see that temperatures are expected into the low 80s through a good chunk of that region, while leaving behind 70s in the west. The Northeast continues to stay cooler, but that area then does become the focus for the lowest humidities on Thursday afternoon. Now, I'm recording this early in the morning and haven't had a chance to look at fuels there again today, but it had looked like there was a little more drying needed to get things going in the Northeast, but a little more yellow or low risk may pop up for parts of New York and southern New England. Otherwise, the Mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, all the way through Ohio and into Indiana do have some elevated concern for Thursday. Now, even though relative humidities have dropped in the west for Thursday, with these strong winds and the fact that this precipitation isn't really coming in until later in the period, I'm keeping concern higher for the western parts of Minnesota until this rain actually comes through. On Friday, cooler weather starts to pop down from the northwest, still staying a little bit cool up in the northeast, and the focus of the heat then moves towards Ohio and West Virginia. Relative humidities continue to stay fairly dry in the northeast, which will definitely need an increase to low risk with this newest model run. Meanwhile, West Virginia will continue to be the focus with the dry fuels in place there and the fact that they're right on the edge of any precipitation that comes in. Meanwhile, a lot of rain is expected in by Friday throughout much of the western two-thirds of the region, and this will help to dampen conditions considerably, but I'm still seeing a concern out here through the western part of Minnesota, where some showers may move through, but on Friday it's going to be windy with a westerly component. The same is true for the northwestern part of Iowa, so keeping elevated concerns there. Confidence in the longer range models is pretty good at this point in time. Keep in mind that these areas of light green are simply chances of rain and not necessarily very heavy or widespread precipitation. The darker areas of green are more likely widespread rain events. So it does look like over the start of the weekend, the mid-Atlantic up into Pennsylvania and West Virginia may actually get some more significant precipitation. However, the models have been kind of indicating this off and on in the last month, and it's just not panned out very well. This wetter air mass does dominate much of the region, however, as we get into the weekend, and then early next week another band does move in to the Great Lakes states and the Midwest. That then shifts over to the East Coast. So we do have waves of moisture coming through that will help to alleviate concerns, but we're still going to continue to focus on the western part of Minnesota in particular, which will get some rain, but really not a lot, and it'll be interesting to see how much the Mid-Atlantic does pick up. The other area I'm paying attention to is the Northeast, as it looks like Saturday, Sunday, and Monday go by with still no precipitation, and the fact that the snow has recently come off there means that those fuels are dry and ready to burn. As we get into week 2, you can see that overall the temperatures look to be colder than normal, pushing into much of the region, with a little bit of above normal or normal in the Northeast. Meanwhile, precipitation looks to generally be above normal chances, at least for the start of that period, but towards the end of the 2 weeks, it becomes more near normal, especially through the Great Lakes states and down into the Ohio Valley. Taking a look at precipitation, again in the upper left, the same graphic showing the heavy rain in the last week reaching from Missouri up into Michigan and then on over into the Northeast. These reddish amounts were about 1.5 inches, where the darker colors start to show, up to the yellows, which were over 4 inches. Notice that, yes, it's been dry throughout western Minnesota and down into the northwest corner of Iowa, with really no rain there. And then down in the Ohio Valley, it's been pretty dry with less than 1/4 inch throughout the southern part of Indiana and Ohio. There has been some precipitation in the Mid-Atlantic, but again, not significant amounts, especially the closer you get to the coast. Snow depth? Well, snow's almost gone. There is still a little bit holding on throughout northern Maine and parts of northern New Hampshire and Vermont over into New York, but it's likely this is going fast. The 7-day precipitation forecast shows that we've got some significant rain coming into parts of the west, although again, western Minnesota may miss the bulk of that. Up in the northeast, these light green areas are less than 1/10 inch. The slightly darker greens are less than 1/4 inch, so really not a lot of precipitation expected up there. And what is inbound would be towards the end of the period. The Great Lakes Fire and Fuel site shows us that today is a big day for Minnesota. Tomorrow will continue to be pretty busy up there with maybe a little expansion over into Wisconsin as well. Then we get to Friday, Saturday, where conditions really tone down, and this is the ISI, the spread index that we're looking at. So this shows an overall softening trend as we get into the weekend. Rounding out a fuels discussion here, the ERCs show very high to extreme values throughout much of Ohio, down into West Virginia, and over into the mid-Atlantic. Notice that western Minnesota down into northern Iowa has also come up into a very high concern category. And most of these areas are holding steady, though these down arrows in parts of West Virginia show a little bit of softening with that expected moisture. However, again, take that with a grain of salt. For the green vegetation fraction, there is more green showing up over a good chunk of Missouri at this point. The southern part of Illinois also has more greening happening. That's true for much of the Ohio Valley. And the mid-Atlantic is looking quite a bit greener, so concerns are dropping off in some of those areas. Meanwhile, we do see more yellows coming into this mid-range, especially around New York and up into the Northeast. So that's an improvement over the brown colors that were here last week. The drought monitor still has us keeping eyes on a number of areas. Again, the southeastern corner of Missouri is quite dry. And then over from West Virginia into the mid-Atlantic, there's a pretty significant drought. Much of New England also under drought conditions, and these areas of Minnesota continue to keep our focus. There is a fuels and fire behavior advisory out that was issued for most of the southeastern part of the country. It does, however, come up into parts of Maryland, the southern tip of Ohio, and all of West Virginia. This is due to just a long period of very dry weather, drying out fuels significantly, and the key here is to not be fooled by fuels that appear to be greened up. Fire is going to spread, especially with just a little bit of wind. To wrap things up, we've got critical fire weather expected again today in the western part of Minnesota with a wind trigger there due to those low humidities and the stronger gusty winds. Fire potential is going to stay elevated for many areas throughout the week, but this pattern decreases as the weekend approaches and into early next week. You can see the graphic here for Monday shows a big softening across most of the region, though New England does start to have a little more concern due to a number of days of drying there. Minnesota and the mid-Atlantic will continue to be areas of concern. There is moisture expected in both of those regions in the next week, but I just don't know that it'll be significant enough to change concerns in the long run. That concludes today's fire weather briefing. Thanks for listening and have a great week.